All right, here we go. Well, welcome everybody to this afternoon session. This afternoon, we're going to be covering an infrastructure project, and we're going to be using the Rockwell Integrated Architecture Builder, IAB tool, to try to take what we've learned about projects, especially in the infrastructure business, and how we would apply that to this tool, how we would want to use that tool to go ahead and build up a project. So, where do we start? Typically one of the first questions is, well, what is Integrated Architecture Builder? How do I get a copy? And then later on, the agenda is going to cover some of these different topics about how to use the various wizards that come with IAB, making some adjustments to the network, the required software and hardware that we may need to add to the system. We're going to be able to review the project, create a final report, and then if necessary, we'll be able to export this project out to another tool from Rockwell called ProposalWorks that you can use in conjunction with your favorite Turtle and Hughes salesperson. All right, so let's kind of start by defining what is IAB. All right, so, and this is a quote from Rockwell. IAB is a free and in the public domain tool. So it is a tool that is available from Rockwell. You can download it from one of their websites, and I can provide a link for that. This tool has actually been around for about 20 years. I remember, however you want to look at this, actually using it 20 years ago and have used it rather consistently ever since. I found it to be an extremely helpful tool. IAB is a rules-based product selection and configuration tool. That's kind of a critical thing. In the past, whenever we've had to do layouts manually, let's say you were laying out a chassis and you were trying to determine whether or not the particular power supply you had selected was going to be able to supply the power to the backplane to the modules. Well, you had to calculate that all out manually. These are the kind of rules that IAB builds into itself so that you don't have to guess at that. It's going to tell you that you're out of power and other rules like that. Okay, it lets you create a report with validated costed bill of material. So if you keep your IAB up to date, you'll be able to have access to at least list pricing and be able to kind of get a sense of what your cost is going to be. And then that validation that we're talking about, it means things like, as I mentioned, the power supplies are large enough for the load. All the required parts, such as terminal blocks and cables, are included. Something we frequently run into where someone gives us a bill of material and I'm like, you forgot all the terminal blocks. So we need to add those into it. It's going to check to see that the devices that can't be used together are prevented from being done so. So you can't, jam certain things together that shouldn't be used together. Also, it's going to check to things like the controllers aren't overloaded with too many I/O devices, remote racks, or there's some communication issues. Some of the various controllers can only handle a certain amount of remote I/O devices. And if you exceed that, if you're not aware of some of those rules or you don't remember, IAB has that built in. So it's going to let you know about that. So we also need a tool that will allow us to design a network and put our devices on that network. And that's become very, very critical these days. Everything is sitting on Ethernet, and we need to be able to lay this network out and tie all these products together. And that's something else that IAB lets us do. So what is IAB? Where do I get a copy? So if you navigate to the Rockwell Automation website, and as I said, I will be sending this presentation out as a PowerPoint that will include this link. But you can then click on that Rockwell Automation website link. You go to the support section, select Integrated Architecture Builder Tools and Resources. Scroll down to the product selection toolbox, click Download Now. There's a contact form if you've never used it. You're going to go ahead and submit that, and then you'll be redirected to the download page, and the download should start automatically. Once you've installed, gone through the installation process for IAB, it comes with an update wizard, and you really want to run that update wizard a couple of times. Even if you just downloaded what you think is the latest and greatest, there's frequently a gap between what's posted as the most recent version plus the additional patches and add-ons that have been done so in between. So once you download IAB and you've run the installation process, I would suggest you manually go ahead and run that update wizard a couple of times, because sometimes you'll have certain updates that can only be added after other updates have been included. So as a rule of thumb, first time running through this, I'll run IAB update wizard like 3 times just to make sure I've got the latest and greatest. And it is a large download. There's a lot of material included with it, so it may take a minute or two for you to download the complete system. All right. Once you've got it installed, there's a few things that you probably want to take a look at first before you jump right into the project. And right up there on top, you're going to see an options section. And this includes IAB options and the report options, as well as some other things as far as how you want your presentations and your data to be displayed. I would recommend going into those options, getting familiar with them. As an example, in the report options section, you can configure what your standard report cover page is going to look like and the contents. So I know it might be a little bit small, but as you can kind of see here, when I'm typically working on a project, there are certain things that I want to include and don't want to include. Something as simple as, well, how do you want your bill of material displayed? As a consolidated bill of material where everything's all kind of packed together, or something that's positional, or something that's organized, right? So in this case, I've said, let's make it a positional type of bill of material. The networks, do I want to include the graphics or not? Do I want to include the layout information or not? These are all some things that you can select. And then down under the bottom there, you can select what your cover page keywords should be, including things like, well, in general, what do you want to call the system? And you can adjust this job by job. So for every time you run the report, you can go into your report options and make these changes. Eventually, we're going to create a report, and that report will be in a Word format, Microsoft Word, which is great because you can always go in there with your standard Word tool to make modifications. All right, so what's done here is not set in stone. It's something that you can always adjust later on. But these are just some of the ways that I typically set up some of my report options when I'm first working in IAB to make sure that my default page looks the way I want it to. All right, so we've gone through some of those standard options, and now we want to jump into our project. All right. And like I said, I'm going to, at the end of this presentation, I'm going to go through we'll actually go through a project creation to see what it looks like. But no surprise, I'm going to click on File and click New. I need to fill in a project name and a location. Now, the location is something that you may want to think about in advance. I have a D drive on my computer. In there, I have a folder called IAB. Under that folder, I have subfolders based on customers. And under each of those customers are another subfolder based on years. I'm trying to keep myself somewhat organized here. I do the same thing because I do a lot of work with Dodge type products. And so I've got a Dodge section, and then that's broken out by year, and then it cascades down from there. You're going to want to create some sort of a format, some operating procedure that you're going to stick with when it comes to your file locations, as well as the file names. Maybe you've got a standard nomenclature where you work, where you use a project name or something like this. Some standard format. Otherwise, you end up saying CompactLogix case number 6, and you're like, what was that? You know, so you want to give it a name and a location that's going to make it easy to find and easy to identify. Once I've identified the name of the project and the location, as you can kind of see in the screen here, there's quite a few choices when it comes to what can I do with this wizard. You're not limited to ControlLogix and CompactLogix. I can use this for Micro 800. I can use this if I wanted to do a migration. Let's say I'm migrating from PLC 5 to ControlLogix, or SLC to a CompactLogix. Maybe I just want to do some sort of a network layout. These are all options that you can do as far as a way of starting off your project. Most often, I'm going to be doing something that involves CompactLogix or ControlLogix. And that's what I would then select. I've now given a name, a location, and I've selected the type of project I'm going to work on. So I'm going to go ahead and click on Create. When I've started that creation process, you're going to come up with a set of screens that are going to walk you through how I want to lay this thing out. Now, in a previous session, I had talked about for an infrastructure project, I've collected in some format, typically a table in a spreadsheet, the various I/O that I'm going to need in my local chassis, as well as what I'm going to need in my remote chassis or chassis plural. And that's what we're going to be doing here, is that data that I collected beforehand, I'm now going to be able to apply here to the wizard. So first thing I'm going to be taking a look at is my chassis network. What power supply do I want to use? In this case, for CompactLogix, do I want to use 1769 as my I/O format, 5069, the newer 5069, or is it going to be 1734? 1734, typically used for, let's say, an L1 type controller, 1769 or 5069 for those corresponding controllers. You also notice that right up on top, you've got an option to fill in the spare I/O count. So sometimes, typically in a specification, it'll say that you want 20% spare. You can either pre-calculate that out yourself, as I sometimes do in my spreadsheet, but sometimes you don't need to. You can just put that right in here, and IAB will automatically take into account whatever that percentage is and apply it to your final I/O totals. So next, the lower portion of that same screen has to do with the network portion. Now, in this case, we're starting a new project, so I want to create a new network. And you have an option of only if necessary to support the I/O, or always. I must always say always. I always want to create a network, because these days, how often do you supply a controller without an Ethernet switch? Not too often. So I'm always going to say always create it with a network. And then you have a choice as far as, well, what kind of Ethernet network do I want to create? Now, if you're dealing with a CPWE type of a layout where you've got distribution switches, access switches, managed switches, a real hierarchy, you use that choice. But typically, I'm not usually at that level. So I say I want to use a free-form model. What this allows me to do is it's going to let me create that network in a much more relaxed fashion without applying those CPWE rules, which is frequently what I run into in the projects that I'm working on. In this case, I can indicate the type of network as well as the topology. Maybe I want this to be a typical star configuration, in which case the last thing on the right there is I can select which switch I want to use. And these are going to be static switches typically. But maybe it's a device level ring, in which case I can change that drop down for, instead of saying a new switch, to a DLR, and then I can identify, is it going to be copper or is it going to be fiber? Once I've made those decisions, I go ahead and click on Next. Now we're going to start getting into the actual I/O that we need for the main control panel. And this is going to walk us right through the inputs, the outputs, and the analogs. So right up front, we're going to take a look. What have I collected with regards to my discrete inputs? Is it AC or is it DC? Or is it safety? You know, I have a choice here as far as what kind of I/O I'm going to be starting off with. And as you can see over on the right side, I have some additional options. Maybe I need conformal coding, or maybe I want to use something other than, let's say, 24 volt DC. Maybe it's 48 volt DC. Maybe it's not 120. Maybe it's 220. There are some other options depending upon which platform you're in on that center column as far as how you may make adjustments there. Otherwise, I'm going to go ahead and fill in the amounts of the I/O for this particular project. On the outputs, it's going to be the same thing. AC outputs, DC outputs, safety outputs, or relay type. And in some cases, you may have a mixture. You may have a certain amount of AC inputs or AC outputs, as well as DC, as well as relay. You're not doing an either or, you can do an and. So you can, depending upon what the specification and the drawings are calling for, you can specify what configuration of I/O, in this case, discrete outputs, you need for the application. Well, if we've done our discrete, we're going to move on to the analog. And here again, is it typical analog input? Is it an RTD? Is it thermocouple? I have a choice as far as which one I want to select. And what you see coming up here will vary depending upon which platform you started with. So if you're in CompactLogix, it may not look exactly the same as if you were in ContractLogix because of the availability of different types of I/O modules. If for some reason you've got some motion involved in your application, this is where you'd be able to indicate whether or not you're using how many axes of motion, and if it's CIP or the older style Circos. We don't see too much Circos anymore. It's kind of an older motion standard. Typically, if there is motion these days, it's going to be involving CIP. We're getting towards the end here. I now have the choice. Do I need some additional networks? Previously, we had occasions where someone wanted ControlNet, DeviceNet, Data Highway Plus. Most of those have been retired or in the process of being retired. But it's not unusual today for someone to say, hey, I've got one network that I'm using to control my local I/O, and I have another network that I'm using to communicate in my peer-to-peer fashion. And in some cases, we'll have 3 different networks. One's going to an HMI system, one's going to local I/O, and one's going to a plant-wide system. This is where you can kind of indicate how many networks you're going to need for this particular application. We're getting to the final page here, and this is going to give us the option of, again, naming this particular control panel, identifying which one, because I do have some drop downs here, so I do have some choices. For example, by default, it may come up with 32-point I/O modules for, let's say, your discrete inputs and outputs. A lot of times when I'm reading a specification, it will call out what the maximum number of I/O points can be in any particular module. So it's not unusual for it to say something like a maximum of 16. Well, fortunately, there's a drop down here when it's selecting that I/O modules where I can say, no, don't use the IB32, use an IB16. So I can go and select that. The same is true of the particular controller I've got. In some cases, depending upon which I/O platform we're in, you may also be able to say, well, what size chassis do I want? Do I want 4, 11, 10, or 13 slot chassis? In addition to on this last page, there may be some other specialty cards. Some other weigh scale module, as an example. There may be other additional cards here that you can add to the system. One of the other things that you can do if you're using a ContractLogix application is indicate that you want slot fillers automatically included. That way, whenever the chassis is laid out, rather than having an open chassis slot, the system will automatically fill in a slot filler. All right, we've created this main panel at this point. I can go ahead and click on Finish. And you're going to get a pop-up. If there are remote racks, you would click on Yes at this point, and it would kind of start the whole process all over again for each remote rack. If there are no other remote racks, I can go ahead and say no, and it's going to bring me out to a point where I can now start looking at other ports of the application. In this case, I said no. I just had a basic chassis, and I have a switch. So when you're in IAB, on the left side and on the bottom, you're going to see a number of tabs. These tabs will take you to different portions of the IAB configuration wizards. And right there where the arrow's pointing, there's an option for the network tab. I'm going to go ahead and click on that. This will bring up what your network currently looks like. Once I'm there, I can say, you know what, I want to rearrange it. I can drag and drop some of these modules in there to make it look a little bit better. I can also use this position to now rename some of these things. As an example, the switch, it may come up by default and say the switch's name is switch 1, but I happen to know that I like to name my switches. If it's a managed Ethernet switch, I'll call it MES, maybe it's CP1, control panel 1. I can rename my devices to match what's showing on the drawings. I also have an option here to add additional items. There may be other things that I want to add to this network. So as an example, maybe I want to add a panel view. I can do that 2 ways. I can go into the Ethernet tab, scroll down until I find the module that I'm looking for. If I happen to know the part number, I can also do a search. There's a search tab on this page that lets me fill it in and do a search for that particular part number. I'll do it both ways. More often than not, I actually go into the Ethernet tab there on the right side
and look for the particular part that I'm going to add. And then I'll go ahead and drop it into the page. And here again, rename it and put it in a position that makes it simple for me to be able to see what's actually going on my network. All right, so this is a pretty simple network. What else might I want to include? And again, the idea here is we're trying to create a complete system, not just a parts list, but more or less a complete system. So if this panel has got a switch, a panel view, and a control CompactLogix, what else might it need? How about a power supply? Now you have a couple of options for power supplies. There's control power and then there's field power. In this case, I'm going to start by looking at the control power. I need to provide a control power source that can power my switch, and in this case, it's a DC panel view, and it's probably a DC power supply for my CompactLogix. So I'm going to go into my control panel power wizard. When I do that, I've got a pop-up on my left side of my screen. Here's the devices that need power. On my right side, this is where I can add the particular power supply I want. And I can kind of narrow down my search based on which family. Do I want the essential or the basic or the performance level, the 1606 power supplies that Rockwell offers. I can add that to the system. And then as I drag and drop things over to that power supply, it's going to calculate what percentage of the load I'm using. So again, maybe your specification says that your power supply can never be more than 50% loaded. So in this case, if I selected, let's say, a 120 volt or a 5 amp, let's say, power supply, and after I drag a few things over there, it comes back and says I'm at 70 or 80%. I know, okay, let's remove that one. Let's go to a 10 amp or a 20 amp and so on. I can automatically have this tell me whether or not I'm overloading my power supply or not. Once I've satisfied that I've got the right power supply with my devices, I can go ahead and click on OK. And maybe now I want to go ahead and add the software. Well, there's a symbol of it looks like a DVD or a CD up there with an R on it, and the R means it's Rockwell. So I'm going to select that so I can pick out the software that I'm going to need for the application. And that's going to give me a software selecting tool where I would say I want to select the software. And in this case, I would prefer to select the software myself. You can do a recommended software, but some of the finer points of the system aren't necessarily in IAB when it comes to pre-selecting the software. Plus, you may know things about the system that IAB at this point doesn't know. Maybe besides the panel view, you know that they're eventually going to be adding some FactoryTalk View SE systems, so you know which version of Studio you really need to include. This is where you can go ahead, go in there, and it's going to give you the ability to select exactly which software you want. And I can narrow that by subscription perpetual, maybe the support level that they want. Do I want media or not? I can go ahead and go in here, select the Studio, in this case, Studio ME and Studio 5000 would apply to what I want. I can go ahead and click on those and click on accept, and that's going to be added to my bill of material in the background back in my IAB project. As I'm going along here, I want to start doing some checking. I want to make sure that my communication is set up the way I wanted it to. So by going into that communication checking tab, I'm going to be given a whole lot of options to show, well, here's what you selected and here's how it's laid out. One of the things I like to check is make sure that my panel views are associated with a particular processor. Sometimes I have more than one processor, and certain panel views are associated with certain processors. I want to make sure that's configured correctly. I also want to make sure that my switch is actually associated with a particular processor if I've got more than one. Because that switch, when it comes to the association, if you're doing your programming, as you may know, you can add that add-on instruction or that information about the switch to your Compact or ControlLogix program so that the device information about that switch is also brought into your PLC. That's why you'd want to go through here and make sure that you've got the correct switch associated with a particular controller. Once you've gone through those tabs, you would go ahead and click on the OK tab, and it would keep that. And here's just another example of when I'm looking for the HMI, making sure my panel view is associated with that particular PLC. I'll go take a look at the errors and warnings. In this case, there's no errors. Everything looks good. And then I get my final page. And here's going to give me some information as far as, some estimates based on the particular processor I've got and the particular layout I've got. And hopefully everything is going to be in the green. And if I've got things that are in the red or in the yellow, that means if it's yellow, hey, I should take another look at that. Maybe I've got a slightly smaller size processor. I'm not exceeding it, but I'm getting into that yellow zone where I'm exceeding, let's say, 60% maybe. If it's red, obviously, I've exceeded the abilities of a particular portion of the control system, and I may need to go back. Because sometimes you can make manual choices, as I showed with regards to the controller, that may not be the best choice for what you're trying to achieve on the overall. All right. At this point, we've checked our system out. We've added our controller. We've added software, our control power supply. Make sure you saved your work. You can now do some other things. Maybe you want to generate a Word document of your project. Maybe you want to generate a proposal works, as well as other types of exports. So let's take a look at some of those. Up on top of the menu, you'll see that there is a Word icon. If you click on that icon, you're going to see a series of pop-ups. You can select either to continue or visit the project checker, which is another way of verifying that you've checked everything out before you've created your report. Select the name and the location of the report. Again, your name and location is kind of critical to make sure you keep things organized. And then you're going to see a series of pop-ups, typically, okay, yes, and yes. I'm going to go through and create a Word document. And like I said, this is a regular Word document. So if I want to go in here and make some edits, I can maybe change some of the boilerplate that comes up with it. Maybe there's certain functions, or maybe I don't want the bill of material included here, or maybe there's certain columns I want to delete. So you can go in here like you would any other Word document, make your edits, or maybe you want to take this and incorporate it with some other document that you're using for your submittals. You've got a lot you can do once you've created this particular Word document, because it's a, open for editing type of a document. Maybe you want to send this bill of material that this system has generated over to your favorite Turtle and Hughes salesperson. So if we were to go back on the file, one of the things you'll notice here is there's quite a few other exports. I can export this whole thing to XML. I can export this to an E-plan if you're using that. In this case, I want to export this to a proposal works file. I'm going to go ahead and select the file that I want it to export it to, and again, indicate where I want the file to be generated. I can at this point also designate how do I want that file to be generated. Should it be organized, positional, or consolidated? And do I want that proposal works file tied directly to my IAB file, so whenever I change one, it's going to be interactive? Or do I want to create these things as two separate documents that I can manipulate on my own? Choice is going to be up to you as far as how you'd want to do that. What else? Well, we've actually covered a small portion of what you can do in IAB. One of the things I suggest is under the help section of IAB, there is a rather extensive set of labs, videos, samples, things for you to learn further about, some quick starts. The video labs typically aren't long, but they walk you through a particular function or feature that you have questions on. I would encourage you to take a look at that help section and take a look at some of those labs as you want to explore IAB further. Who do I call for help? I've got some questions, I've got some issues. What do I do? You can always contact I spend pretty much on a daily basis, I'm in IAB working on a project and have been for about 20 years. So I'm pretty familiar with how to do things within the software package. But you can also send questions directly to the IAB support team. So again, under the help section down there at the bottom, contact us. What that's going to do is it's going to automatically generate an email document with some information about your particular installation. And then we typically encourage you to include or attach a copy of the project that you're working on. That way, the support engineer can take a look at what you're doing at the same project that you're actually in the middle of. So that's another option if you need some assistance. All right. At this point, I'd like to go ahead and change screens, and we're going to kind of walk through a bit of a live demo. As always, if you've got any other questions, here's my name and contact information, and I will be sending out this presentation in a PDF format for you to take a look at. So let's take a, I'm going to stop sharing this screen, and I'm going to jump over to my IAB system so we can actually kind of take a look at and run through an IAB project. And again, we'll just kind of walk through this kind of quickly. As I was describing earlier, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and say start. I'm going to create something new. We can call this Demo 1, very informative. And you can kind of get a sense of all the various projects that I've been working on in the past couple of weeks. And so you can go ahead and browse and say, well, let's see, in this particular case, where do I want to store this? I'm going to just drop this under my normal IAB location. I've called it Demo 1. And in this case, what do we want to create? Like I said, we've got a choice as far as ControlLogix, CompactLogix. We've got migrations. I'm going to go ahead and say, let's do a ControlLogix project. As I described, you've got a lot of options. This may look a little different than when we were the example, because that one's based on CompactLogix. Maybe I want to add the slot fillers. Maybe I want to say we've got some spares. Maybe this is a redundant controller chassis. All right, this is a larger project, so I'm going to tell it I want a redundant ControlLogix chassis. I can either auto size those chassis, or I can specify. Maybe I know there's a limitation in the amount of space I've got access to, so I want to go ahead and say I want to limit to maybe 13 slots. Do I need redundant power supplies? Do I know what my power supply is going to be? In this case, let's leave it at 120. I want to do this regardless of the I/O count. I want to make sure we create this. I'm not going to do the CPWE. I'm going to use a freeform. And I do want to use a switch here. So here's my switch wizard. So I have access to Stratix 5700s, 5410s, 5400s, as well as a host of other types of managed and unmanaged switches. And then I can kind of narrow that selection down based on what else I may need. So by checking some of these boxes, do I need, as an example, network address translation? Well, if I did, I could go ahead and select that one. And that's going to be the switch we'll use for this application. In this case, we are going to have a mixture. So let's say I've got 30 non-isolated AC inputs. And let's say we've got 30 non-isolated DC inputs. And as I mentioned, under the dropdown, in this case, I have a choice of 24 volt or 48 volt. And on the AC side, I still got some 24 volt AC as an option. That's a little rare. I don't run into that too often. I can also make these diagnostic type of I/O modules if I needed to. Here again for my outputs. Do I want isolated or non-isolated? Do I want diagnostic? Do I need fused? What other options do I have? 240 volt as a possibility. Well, in this case, I'm going to say again, I've got 30 of these. Maybe I've got 20 of these, and I've got 10 isolated relay type. For my analog, I've got 12 of these, 6 of these, and I want to have 4 of these. And this is all the stuff that I've collected from reading through my specification and the drawings for the particular project. I don't have any need for any additional networks in this case. So at this point, you're going to come up with some default values here as far as what will work. And as I mentioned, by default, it's telling me that I can use these IA32s and IB32s, but I happen to know I don't want to use those things. So I'm going to change those to 16-point cards. This is a brand new installation, so I'd rather not use an L73. I'm going to change it to, let's make it an L82E. This happens to be the main control panel. That's what I want to call this. Here's an IF16. Here's my analogs. And then down here, as you can see, there are some additional modules that I could select if the system, called for it. And again, under ControlLogix, you might see a lot more options here than what you would see under CompactLogix.
Dwayne, I have a question. This is Ilan.
Yes, sir.
Can you hear me? When you select the cards, can you right there assign it to a specific rack slot? Or you just pulling it in?
IAB is going to put them in a slot by itself, and then you have the option later of rearranging those modules.
So it will decide where to park them. But
Correct.
I can go back and massage it.
Yes, you can.
All right. What about specialty modules? Are these also available on that list, such as in-rack, Modbus gateways, and stuff like that?
Well, there are going to be some modules available there. The rest are going to be available as we go through the installation process. I can go ahead and add, and I'll show you that in a few minutes, where I can add some additional, let's say, third-party cards, because there are quite a few third-party Encompass partners who have their modules included in the integrated architecture builder.
Okay.
So in this case, if I said, yes, I do have a remote rack, I can go ahead and, fill in some of the, it's going to look somewhat the same, except here's all the possible I/O platforms I could be using as I'm going through this process. So here again, I may just want to say that just to kind of put a few in here, I'm going to say I've got 10 of these. 10 here, and let's 2 of these in this particular remote rack. And as you can see, as I've been adding stuff to that, it kind of eliminated I/O platforms that don't meet the criteria of what I was looking for. At this point, it's given me one particular choice, but I can hit this drop down and select which I/O platform that remote rack should be. So maybe I want to use the new Flex 5000. I could go ahead and select that, and it will reconfigure the system to meet that need based on that I/O platform. If I wanted to, I could say, well, let me preview what that's going to look like, because I can preview it and actually create multiple versions if I needed to be able to do a comparison. Because then I can, once I do the preview, I can actually export that as an Excel spreadsheet. So now I could create multiple versions and kind of do a side-by-side comparison. So here's what this is going to look like. And I can go ahead and say, I want to save that to an XLS type of a program so that I can make maybe multiple copies. In this case, I've got my IB, my OB, my IF, my wiring method. I can either do a screw type or clamp type. And there are a few other additional options if I needed a high-speed counter, things like this, for Flex I/O. I'm going to say finish, and I don't want to add any more I/O in this case. So if I take a look at this tab, here's my layout. It took into account the spares I asked for, and it created all 13 slot chassis. In this case, as I was saying, you can manipulate this manually afterwards. In this case, I say, you know what? My main chassis is going to be redundant. I don't need all these spare slots. So I'm going to go ahead and right-click, say I'm going to configure this chassis. I'm going to uncheck this box. So here's the chassis now without any of those spare slots taken up. I'm going to go back in there. Let's change this to a 4-slot chassis. And now I've reconfigured it. So now I've got my EN2T card. I've got an L81 or an L82E. And here's my RM2.
And here's my Flex IO rack. Again, it's giving me some spares because of how I've configured the rack. I can come back in here and say, well, let's configure the chassis. I can tell it how many slots I'm going to be using. And I can also do some other modifications if I needed to. Maybe I want to split this into two, but in this case, I don't really need to. But if I had a lot of IO, maybe I need to have it split 4 and 4 as opposed to, let's say, all 8. If I pop over here, I can take a look at my network now. Let's see how this is actually laid out. Well, it didn't lay it out the way I want it. So I'm going to go ahead and swing this around, kind of make this thing look a little bit better. You can rearrange this pretty much any way you want. One of the things that I'd like to see improved on here is some additional features under this portion that maybe snap to locations, things like that, make it a little bit easier to lay this thing out. And as I said, at this point here, I can come in here, right click on it, I can rename it. I can come back in here and configure the switch. So right now it said, well, based on the switch that you asked for, here's the name. And here's what's connected to what. And I can move those around. If I say, you know what, I don't want this on this particular slot, I can move it to another location. I do have some flexibility when it comes to how this thing gets laid out. It's going to come up with a default version. You can select and make further changes as far as how that goes. Now, Ian, you were asking me about, changing things in my slot. So let's say I happen to know that out here, I really need to include, I don't know, maybe a Modbus card of some sort. So let's go ahead and remove, I'm going to remove this spot. And down here, I have, down at the bottom, I've got a choice of a bunch of different tabs, including other networks, technology partner products, things like that. So let's take a look at technology partner products. And what am I looking for? Maybe
ProSoft?
Yeah, so let's take a look at a ProSoft card.
Nice.
Well, so there's a number of products that are coming up here under ProSoft, and these happen to be gateway type products.
Yep.
Maybe I want something that's in rack. So I'm going to pop back in here into the Ethernet section. And as you can see, again, I've got a lot of choices as far as what I want to add to my Ethernet network. And maybe I've got to add, again, some technology partner stuff. So let's take a look under ProSoft, communication. Lots of choices when it comes to what I want to put in here. So there may be others that you're looking for. Maybe you've got Mettler Toledo. Maybe you've got some Hardy type device. Maybe there's some Anderson Hauser you want to drop in here. There's a number of manufacturers who have products that can be dropped into this location.
Is there an option to add a manual thing there? If it does not list it there? Or it's got to be
you can
from
put in,
.list?
you can add a generic one.
And just label it or name it?
Yeah, so in this case, here's some of those ProSoft cards. These are going to be the in-chassis ones. So if we were looking for, I don't know, here's a Modbus card. I can go ahead and grab this and drag that up in here. So now I've added this Modbus card to my system. And as you'll notice, as I've added things here, it's going to make adjustments over on this side, on the right side, as far as your power consumption and so on. So it's constantly taking that into account. How much power am I drawing off of this particular power supply?
So is it going to flag it if I exceed the capacity of this power supply and recommend to say, hey, you need a bigger one?
Yes, it will. It's going to come back in here, and you're going to see something in red. It's going to tell you that, hey, you've exceeded something. You've overloaded this power supply. I can't. In this case, control power status, field power status. It's in red. It's saying, hey, you forgot something here. So as I mentioned in the presentation, if I come up here, here's some of the devices that need a power supply, and I can go ahead and tell it, okay, I want to use essential. It's going to be 120, and I need at least, say, 20 amps. And I can go ahead and, add a power supply, highlight my device.
and it's telling me that I'm only using 14% of the available power for that particular power supply. When I say OK, I should see a change here as far as that I've now, provided enough power for this particular unit. As I mentioned, you always want to do some checking. So here's my project checker. It's going to come back and tell me if there's any errors, any alerts. Here's some warnings that I can take a look at, and any other information tabs that are available. I can also come out here to my communication checker, and that's going to give me that overall picture. Am I in the green on everything? Do I have anything I need to be aware of? Am I exceeding some of the abilities of my controller or my network? In this case, I haven't added a device to it yet. And then, like I said, if I wanted to, besides the power supply, I could also add my Rockwell software. There's some other technology partner. Maybe you want to add a Stratus controller or other visualization tools. So there's other things that you can add to this, and periodically there's changes to this where other vendors want to have some additional stuff put in there. In this case, we can kind of look at, maybe you want to add an FT server or a ZTC Edge from Stratus. I can add that to my system right from here as well. And then if there's some other piece of hardware that you need to add to the network that may not be coming up here, you do have access to a lot of the other older platforms and devices that can be actually added into the system and dropped into your network that you can connect into. Like I said, here's my Word document generator, which I would use if I'm going to go ahead and create the Word document. And then over here, here's, again, all that access to all those other things I could possibly export this out to.
Can it generate Visio?
See, Visio is here.
Yeah. Oh, perfect.
And again, some of them I have found to be better than others. Certain ones seem to keep a more complete picture, so to speak, when I do the export. But yeah, there are a couple of things that you can export out to, so Visio is one of them. All right, we're just about out of time here. I want to leave a few minutes for everyone in case there's any questions. Any questions on either the presentation or the demonstration at this point? All right, well, if there are no other questions, like I said, this session has been recorded and I will be making that recording available. And I'll also be sending out this as a PDF format. So if you're interested in getting a copy of the PDF format of this presentation, as well as a link to the video, drop me a note and I will make sure we get that out to you. Thanks for your time. Appreciate you being here. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to give me a call. Thanks, folks.